That's the problem we face today, is one of mass. And mass not just in the number of ships and planes and tanks, but mass in just an amount of ammunition. They have stockpiled so much ammunition in China. They're putting out ships, airplanes, tanks, and our shipyards are gone. They're broken. There is no way we can sustain any war for maybe more than a couple of days. Meanwhile, they're stockpiling. How effective are you going to be in a battleship, or in a submarine, or in a fighter, or a bomber, or in a tank with no ammunition, and your enemy is full of ammunition? We're not even thinking about the doctrine of mass. We almost believe our own press clippings about how good we are as a military. It doesn't matter if your opponent has more mass than you do. And what I'm telling you right now is the Chinese have so much more mass. They can make Taiwan look like the surface of the moon and not even put a dent in their stockpiles. How the U.S. is going to be able to counter the PLA? We're not even close. We can't. We absolutely can't. And this mass is always going to kill you if the adversary has the advantage. In this case, they have the advantage.
Let's go!
Welcome back to the show, everybody. I Came With Fire podcast. Today we are here with special guest, retired Air Force General Robert Spalding, author of a couple different books, but yours was one of the first books that was actually ever recommended to me in my career in the Air Force. I know a lot of people like to recommend books, but that didn't happen to me till much later in my career on the way out of the Air Force. So, but I got it right here behind me, War Without Rules. I think it's excellent. I love the fact that you take such a hard line with China and the CCP specifically, and I love how you articulate how, I guess, the U.S. government doesn't even understand the CCP the way that they should. And that's something it actually makes it hard to have a conversation with other people, because I think that there's this sort of belief now that everybody is the same, right, around the world, and that talking about maybe the CCP or the Chinese population is this just the same as talking about, you know, the American government or the American population, and the same things motivate us and the same things drive us day to day. But again, thank you so much for your time, for coming on here. I'll give you the opportunity to introduce yourself as well, and we'll jump in.
Thanks. Yeah, Rob Spalding, retired from the Air Force, flew B-2s for most of my career, spent a lot of time in China. I was the defense attaché in Beijing. My last job was as a senior director for strategic planning at the White House at the National Security Council, where I worked on the national security strategy, and also worked on 5G as a technology, and that's what I do now. I'm the CEO of a company called Semper, and we produce hardened digital infrastructure for cloud and telecommunications.
Mm-hmm. So in your business dealings, then, you've probably worked a lot with the Chinese and Chinese companies?
No, I mean, we specifically stayed away from China. Like, none of our components are sourced from China. That's China awesome. Is all over our telecommunications and cloud infrastructure today, and we didn't want to have any part of that. So no. I haven't really gone back to China since I got out of the Air Force. I haven't, I thought, at the time, when I lived there the first time, I thought I was going to, spend a lot of time working in China. And as I got to know the Chinese Communist Party and the challenges we have with China, which, as you say, are in my book, Stealth War and War Without Rules, then, I had a completely change of heart.
Right. How long did you live there? And when you're doing defense attaché stuff, like, to me, my security forces brain sounds like you're, going around making plans for people's travel and all that stuff. Is that what you were doing, the same thing, or?
So the defense attaché wears many hats. My first time in China, I lived there for 2 years. I was a Olmsted Scholar. So basically, I studied at Tongji University, mostly MBA classes in Chinese. And the Olmsted Scholar program is really for officers to get exposed to a foreign culture, to a foreign language, to live in a country. And so that, if you get promoted and happen to become a senior leader, which I was, you can make better decisions. And then,
Sure.
because of that experience, the Air Force wanted me to become the defense attaché. The defense attaché works for the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He works for the Secretary of Defense. He works for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he works for in China for the Indo-PACOM commander. So you wear a lot of hats, and you're supporting engagement with the Chinese military on behalf of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense. You're providing, your best estimate of things that are happening in China to the Defense Intelligence Agency. So what do you observe? What do you see in the country? And that's used, of course, to inform how we think about China from an intelligence perspective. And then for the Indo-PACOM commander, you're also engaging the Chinese military on his behalf. All three of those senior leaders, the Secretary of Defense, the chairman, and the Indo-PACOM commander, have to have friendly relations with the Chinese military. And so we're kind of the guys on the ground doing that on behalf of each of those staffs.
Sure. You were saying before that living there gave you a change of heart. Was there a specific experience or maybe set of experiences where you kind of just realized that something's not right here and that the way we're going about this and our relations between the U.S. and China is all wrong?
Yeah, and it didn't come from living there. And what I will say is it's very difficult if you're not Chinese to understand what's going on there in China, because a lot of the stuff that the Chinese Communist Party does, even when you're living in China, is not apparent to people that are living there that aren't from China, that aren't Chinese. The whole indoctrination program that they have in their education system is actually quite thorough, and
Right.
their media is very good at only casting one point of view, and then they have this great firewall that prevents the Chinese people from really having any other view.
Mm-hmm.
And so when when I got there in 2002 as an Olmsted scholar, you would frequently hear, for example, um, you know, democracy is not really for the Chinese people. Like the Chinese people can't really accept that as a governing structure, and it was universal. No matter who I talked to, no matter where I went in the country, they had the same message. And what you don't realize is that's been drilled into them throughout their life, throughout their education. It's all they ever hear. And so, where here you would hear something, a point of view, and it would be varied many times. There, you're not going to get variance in terms of things like that. Political things, they're all
Mm-hmm.
consistent across the board. Everybody shares the same tune. And so, when I left China the first time in 2004, I wasn't. I had a great experience. I brought my family with me. My boys, when we got there, were 4 and 7. Traveled all over the country. Really got to know the people. I spent a year at DLI learning Chinese, Defense Language Institute, before I went. So I spoke Chinese when I went over there, and could get around fairly well. And I had a very positive experience, and I enjoyed it. I loved it. The Chinese people were great. I didn't really have much interaction with the government or the military. It's all pure university experience and traveling. And then, coming back when I got hired to work for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs as the senior China guy, I really started to get into, how does the government act? I knew about China and living in China, but I really didn't understand the governing structure. And so
Mm-hmm.
started to study that. I had a staff of people that had lived in China, working in the embassy and done other things. They're all military guys that
Mm-hmm.
spoke Chinese, like me. But unlike me, they'd gone over and worked in a government position as opposed to being just a student at a university. So they had a
Right.
much better view of China from the government perspective. And then the assignment before I went to be work for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I was at the Council on Foreign Relations as a military fellow. And there I met a lot of business people, and I met one guy in particular where we had lunch and we were debating China. And that guy, essentially sent me a presentation that had been put together by one of the top 5 accounting firms, detailing, multiple instances of how Chinese company had gone after a U.S. company to steal either intellectual property or market
Mm-hmm.
share. And I remember I recognized at the time, and now this was 2014, so a full 10 years after I'd left China,
Mm-hmm.
and I was working for the chairman, and I realized, okay, the things that I thought about China, I completely missed these other signs that are generally opaque if you don't look for them. They're not readily apparent, and so I had to go reassess my own views of China, and that led to a whole host of work that we did there on the Joint Staff. Led to the start of an office within the Air Force called the Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis, and really led to the 2 books that I wrote, and
Mm-hmm.
changed the direction of my life, because what I realized was that ideologically, politically, the Chinese Communist Party was completely at odds with the United States, sought the destruction of our constitutional republic, and we're doing it in ways that, quite frankly, we don't typically consider war,
Mm-hmm.
and or we consider to be below the threshold of war. And I
Right.
think we find, or we believe, I think we believe that our country is very resilient to this type of political warfare. But what you find is, since the end of the Cold War, the rise of the internet and the mobile economy and the tech giants, and their vast integration with the Chinese economy, that we're not really resilient to this type of political warfare. We're actually quite vulnerable, and that was an epiphany that I had in 2015 that changed the course of my life.
Yeah. How many people around you in 2015 were having that same epiphany, or were you alone in that for the most part?
Well, so remember I said I had a staff working for me, and
Mm-hmm.
one of those guys was named Matt Turpin. Matt was a Army officer, and he
Okay.
had just come over from the Indo-PACOM staff. He was an armor guy, so tank driver, and he had taught at West Point, and a very strategic, very thoughtful officer. And so when I saw that presentation, I sent it over to him, and I said, "Hey, we need to get after this." And so he became my partner in this effort. And eventually, when I went to the White House, when I left in 2018, he followed and became the policy director for China at the National Security Council. So,
Mm-hmm.
and he stayed throughout the rest of the Trump administration. And then there was another gentleman. His name was Scott Baum. He was ended up retiring as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Policy, and he was an Army Reserve officer, retired as a colonel in intelligence, and was also an Air Force Senior Executive Service civilian. And so he really, on the Air Force side, became a lot of the, had a lot of the leadership over what the Air Force did, based on what we found. And so those two and me really started to create a coalition within government that would start to look at the problem. And that coalition, this started in the Biden administration, and that
Okay.
coalition was really activated when the Trump administration came in. So, there was people in the beginning. There was really very few. The 3 of us, myself, Matt Turpin, and Scott Baum. And then after that, we started going to all the interagency partners around the government, and started to recruit people that had a similar view. And Oftentimes they didn't have a similar view in the beginning, but as we laid out our case and we showed evidence, they came around. And so, and really,
Right.
if you're going to do something where you change, where you create change, or you agitate for change in the federal government, you have to bring your facts, and it has to be a coalition of like-minded people that are working not totally in concert, because we were all in different agencies,
Yeah.
but more or less along the same lines, in terms of, we recognize there's a problem here. It's not a problem that our policies are dealing with. We have to educate, we have to advocate, and we have to do what we can in our various positions, and be ready for an opportunity for a change.
Mm.
That change came when President Trump was elected in 2016, because there was a willingness to then explore a different approach to China.
Right. It's so interesting to hear that you, I guess, had to do all this legwork to convince people that there was a problem, because for a long time, even before I joined the Air Force, seeing 2000, 2008, 2009, like, I was even aware there's enough OSINT out there about how just basic American tech is being copied by the Chinese. So if the average American citizen, me, fresh out of high school, basically a couple years into college, can recognize that and see that for what it is, it's sort of unsettling to hear that officials in our government that need to be convinced, essentially, to shift their worldview on that. Like, what sort of evidence, when you say you're presenting this, right? Like, obviously you have to have facts, okay? You have to come with all that. I'm well aware of that. But what sort of evidence are you presenting to say, hey, this isn't just like, typical tech copying one another, right? That happens all over the place. We see it in the civilian market all the time. But what evidence are you bringing, serious evidence, to the table to say, hey, this is a problem, and it's a national security issue that we need to go into headstrong?
Well, in the beginning, we had to start from a position that created a compelling argument as what we were finding as it being a national security threat. You have to understand, the entire intelligence apparatus that is supporting the Department of Defense is focused around the military capabilities of our adversaries.
Right.
And so the way we did that in the very beginning was, there's a few things that we have that are clearly superior to the Chinese. One of them is jet engines.
Mm.
And so what we did was, in the very beginning of the Office of Commercial and Economic uh, analysis, excuse me, we started looking at what were the Chinese doing to get access to the technology that really made jet engines in America far superior to anywhere else in the world. And so
Right.
that analysis required, basically an industry analysis of the production of, high performance jet engines. And so what we found was, like, the really the hardest thing to do, and it's even harder, quite frankly, than landing a man on the moon, is the material science that goes into building the blades that go into high performance jet engines like those in the F-22. And so there's a couple of different techniques that are used to manufacture them. One is uh, uh, ceramic matrix composites, which is mostly a more or less a composite technology. And
Okay.
then there are titanium, 3D printed, actually titanium
Mm.
alloy blades. The ceramic matrix composite they can go up to like 2,500 degrees, and the titanium blends can go, right up to 2,000 degrees.
Wow.
And if you can't make those blades, you can't build a high performance jet engine like those in the F-22. And so
Right.
then we had to show, okay, well, here's who has the technology, and here are the steps that the Chinese are taking to acquire that technology. And once they acquired it, the rest of the stuff is going to be within their reach. And so And so that was kind of how we started to show them, like, if you focus just on military capabilities, they are acquiring all the advanced technology they need to surpass us in those capabilities. And so when you look at it from a military perspective, frequently would say, yeah, they have, they're spending a lot on military, but they don't have these things. They can't build jet engines like we can, for example. But if you could show that they were acquiring or were about to acquire those capabilities, people would become alarmed and they would start to pay attention.
Right.
And so that's how it began. And then it progressively moved up to now you see both in the Congress and the administration a recognition that political influence is happening in our universities, in our political system, with our corporations, and we're finally beginning to do something about it. But you couldn't go right there in the very beginning because there just wasn't an interest in focusing on that.
Is that because of the global war on terror?
Partially, yeah. I mean, I think that took a lot of the focus. If you know, at the time, the entire basement of the Pentagon was the AFPAC hands, you know, the Afghanistan, Pakistan hands, you know, the Iraq war, everything was going, was focused on that. If you went over to the CIA and you looked at where was all the talent going, where were they spending all the money? It was all in the Middle East. It was all on Pashto speakers or Arabic speakers or Urdu speakers. If you looked at what they had in terms of Chinese speakers, very few. When you started to look at who's working in the China shop and the CIA, very young folks, oftentimes right out of college. All the senior folks had gone over to do, you know, where the important work was viewed then towards the Middle East. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the entire federal government, no matter what agency or department you went to, everybody was kind of focused on the Middle East, particularly after 9/11. So yeah, I think that's where the money went. That's where the resources went. That's where the people went. That's how you could get promoted. If you're going to make SES, you weren't going to make it working in China necessarily. You're going to make it working in the Middle East, and the same for officers. I was one of the few that really had very little time in the Middle East. I went to Iraq and did my tour there, but you know, obviously, a lot of the senior leaders that got promoted in all the services spent many tours in the Middle East and had literally no time in Asia or very little time. And so, yeah, that was a big part of it.
For sure. Have you seen the CIA's new ad that they put out trying to target Chinese civilians? What do you think about that? Your impression? I saw a lot of these. I think it's funny. A lot of these X accounts that are actually run by the Chinese government. They brag about how, yeah, this is official propaganda pages, but at least we're honest about it. I think it's funny. A lot of those were coming out and making fun of the language and how there was still, it's not very good Mandarin. All of these things. What was your impression? And I'd be curious to get your take on whether or not you think it's going to be successful, this campaign to try and entice the Chinese to come and help the CIA.
Yeah, so you have to understand kind of what happened once. In Tiananmen Square, after Tiananmen Square, the Chinese leadership, Communist Party leadership, got together and they said, okay, we're going to lose control of this if we don't get more control over the population in terms of, you know, their alignment with Chinese Communist Party being the leader of the country. Yeah. We also need economic help from the West, and so somehow when we couple economically with the West. What tends to come, and we saw, this is them talking. We saw this in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. What tends to happen is those countries democratize, and so there's not just a flow of technology. There's not just a flow of business sense. There's a flow of ideas and ideology. We cannot have the flow of ideas and ideology come along with the technology and business sense. And so we have to separate those two. We need to get the first two, but we don't want any of the ideas and ideology to come across. And so they worked really hard at that. Again, great firewall, indoctrination through all levels of education, locked down the media, controlled what the Chinese people had access to. And then the benefits that came out of that, though, after 2007 and the introduction of the iPhone, was that as the social media environment started to grow and become so instrumental in kind of driving cultural behavior and ideas, they realized, the Chinese Communist Party realized, they had an ability to control that, not just domestically, but globally for the Chinese-speaking diaspora. What does that mean? When you are a Chinese living in China and you have your social media apps, they're all Chinese. The Great Firewall prevents any other country's application or technology from being available from a social media perspective to the Chinese people. So what happens? They leave China, they come to America, they go to Europe, they go to any other free country. They don't get rid of their social media apps. They don't get rid of the things that they were doing digitally. They take them with them. And by virtue of the fact they take them with them, the Chinese Communist Party is already embedded in their digital space, and allows them to continue to curate what they see and what they hear. And so what this means is the Chinese Communist Party can control the diaspora using WeChat, using Tencent, using Weibo, using Douyin, which is the Chinese equivalent to TikTok. And so when the CIA comes and says, hey, we want to recruit these people, what they don't understand is they're already recruited. Like, they are bought into the Chinese Communist Party message. And one of the things the Chinese Communist Party tells them quite clearly is that beware of foreign spies. So in essence, you could say that where an intelligence a person joining the intelligence community would get educated on to be concerned about counterintelligence issues, their entire population is educated on counterintelligence issues. And so because of that, and because they're inculcated with Chinese Communist Party ideology, they're already immunized against you trying to go and recruit them. And so yeah, I mean, I think it's a big problem. And the fact that people think that they can get past that. There's actually a very good article by a journalist. Her name's Li Yuan. She works at the New York Times. I think it's something like Chinese Communist Propaganda in the Age of Instagram. I think it might be the title, something like that. But she wrote it several years ago. And she explains, coming out of China, her response, when somebody said Taiwan, was immediately, that's China's. Taiwan is China's. And she, at some point after she'd come to America, she realized she was doing that she had this, just instant reaction to the word Taiwan. And so she started to self-examine, why am I responding like this? Like, people say Taiwan, I say that's China's. And she realized she had been programmed to do that. And that's literally how Chinese typically respond to that stimulus. And so she wrote an article, and she talked about how there's a book about a girl that was kidnapped in Utah and held in a basement for over a decade. And in that book, she writes about how she had been brainwashed and how she had to deprogram herself. So Li Yuan talks about having to go through a very similar deprogramming effort to get her to stop, to recognize, okay, I have all these triggers that have been placed inside of me because of my education in China, because I grew up in China, and I have to be able to understand that is not just intrinsic to me. That was placed there by the Chinese Communist Party, and I have to go through the process of getting rid of that. So already, when you're we're going to say, hey, we want to go recruit somebody, I think the way that you would do that is you would go through an evaluation process with somebody, because if you're dealing with somebody that has not, in other words, become self-aware, then there is no way that you're going to be able to recruit them, because they are already conditioned to know that you're trying to recruit them, and therefore you're a spy. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
No, it does. It's like you already know I'm coming, so you know to expect me. So when I show up, it's just like, oh, yep, there you are, and I've already been programmed to sort of push you off to the side, and therefore render you ineffective, right? How do
Right.
you even how do you even compete with that, really, when you talk about like the social programming that you were talking about with Lee Yuan and the whole Taiwan thing? I think TikTok has done an outstanding job of socially conditioning Americans in a totally different way, and obviously, like, you and I know that that's on purpose, and that goes back to that sort of asymmetric warfare that you talk so much about in your books. But the thing that used to concerned me a lot when I was so I separated just over a year ago. But the thing that used to concern me a lot was talking to a lot of the airmen that I supervised. Right, I was a tech sergeant. And trying to explain some of these things, and suggesting your book, a C-17 pilot is who recommended it to me. I read it, then read Stealth War. We talk about asymmetric warfare a lot on this podcast. You may be familiar with maybe the One's Ready podcast, 3 AFSPEC war guys. We talk about it with them pretty often. But when I would talk about this stuff to the airmen, they were pretty apathetic towards it. Didn't care. Seemed to think that it just wasn't their problem, which is terrifying when you think about, like, well, it is your problem. You're serving in the U.S. military. That's the definition of your problem. And it actually got me in some hot water with my unit leadership, because basically I was too doom and gloom about things, trying to get people to focus on stuff, and these airmen are just trying to get through their day, out at the gate or whatever, and it's trying to have these conversations just to put a bug in their mind, and it reaches a couple of them, and they ask questions, and like, hey, Sergeant Gresham, what was that book you were talking about? And I'm like, yeah, here it is. There's even an audio book. You can put it on in the patrol car while you're driving around and listen to it. And but I mean, how do you even compete with that? It feels like you can't, because our population and the military being downstream from the regular American population, it's almost like you have two different you have two different worlds that people are living in, and it's almost impossible to reach people and get them to understand that they have been socially conditioned in a totally different way because of the media that they consume. So that feels like I guess a lost battle in a way. Would you agree?
Yeah, you can't compete with it. The problem is that it is political warfare. Our society is meant to be a republic, and by design, a republic requires the citizens to actually be critical thinkers,
Mm-hmm.
be a little
Oh,
bit
yeah.
suspicious of the government, and the Chinese Communist Party preys on our population because we are so distracted by each other. What does that mean? Well, if you were to say, who is best positioned in the United States to fight and defeat the Chinese Communist Party,
Okay.
outside the tech companies, which have enormous resources and a more enormous sway over the narrative, the common narrative, it would be the political parties of the United States.
Sure.
The Republican Party and the Democratic Party understand how to do political warfare because this is what they do. The problem is they do it against each other, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so what the Chinese Communist Party is kind of like the third party in America, and it preys on the fact that the two parties that should be upholding support for the Constitution, for our principles and values, are really more concerned about each other and don't see the Chinese Communist Party as a problem for them. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and then national security wise, we tend to think of a military threat as being much more existential than, say, a political threat, a global political threat like the Chinese Communist Party. So when you think about it from, how does a free society, which is not built for political warfare, because you could say, well, let's take one approach, and that approach is let's have the complete opposite narrative and political point of view of the Chinese Communist Party. Let's force that into our schools. Let's force that into our churches. Let's force that into our corporations and financial institutions. Let's force that throughout the government. What you then start to become is an authoritarian system that is on the other side, right? And so we can't do that, or we don't want to do that, because then you're creating exactly what the Constitution was meant to prevent, which is this one overarching political power in the country. And so since we can't do that and we don't want to do that, actually some want to do that in the country, some from both of the parties. I mean, it's just the nature of how political parties are. Since we don't want to do that and can't do that because of our Constitution, then to me, the only avenue that we really have to protect our society, right, protect the homeland, protect our sovereignty and our political independence, is to basically just separate. Now, that's what we did with the Soviet Union. We separated ideologically, politically, economically. There was very, very little interaction between our companies, our financial institutions, our universities, and the American people with the Soviet Union. We were decoupled in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what we've done is essentially coupled with China in all the ways that we didn't with the Soviet Union. And if you listen to, even today, when Scott Bessent talked about the talks in China, what did he say? He said, well, we both agree that we don't want to decouple. And in that statement, essentially, is the challenge that America has. And that is, economically, financially, there's so much pressure from the corporate sector and the financial sector to stay economically coupled to China that we can't do the things that actually protect our country from this political influence, right? We feel like we have to stay coupled. And I think we think that our society is resilient enough to overcome that. I fear, for exactly the same reasons you talked about the airmen being apathetic, that we're not. And that's because what happened at the same time the Chinese were figuring out how to use these digital tools to control their own population, even after they left China, the tech companies were figuring out the same thing. And what you have now with the rise of the internet is a consolidation of media. So we used to have, local papers with local editors who had their own points of view. Now we have consolidated all major media into about 5 major corporations, which has a common narrative with the university system, the financial sector, the corporate sector. And so now you have, and that's the challenge that we have today is from a digital sovereignty perspective in America, is that all of these combine to create a common narrative in the United States that once you start to question that narrative, you are more or less demonized, right? And that's where the canceling has come from, where the government's working with Twitter, now X, to basically deplatform people, where YouTube basically demonetizes people that aren't consistently following the narrative. These tools are now in place to, in the same way that the Chinese Communist Party has indoctrinated their society, to indoctrinate Americans. And so unless we can split that out, if we can't pull the Communist Party out of us, we can't decouple, as opposed to remaining coupled. We can't decouple because they're very happy with mainstream media. They're very happy with the tech companies. They're very happy with the university system, the financial sector, the banks, the corporate sector. Why? Because all of them have this view that China is, and being coupled to China is good for us. And so as long as that stays, I feel we've got, just enormous challenges in maintaining the viability of our constitutional republic.
No, I agree completely. The open society that you talked about that we have in the United States, the Chinese have found a way to use that against us, and there's a lot of examples of that. I was just joking the other night on our live show about how there's that list of Chinese companies that the U.S. isn't supposed to work with, and how that list is sort of superfluous because the Chinese know, well, now I'm on that list, I'll just make another company, and then we'll keep doing the same thing, and we'll import this part or do whatever we're going to do. And there's one of these companies that there's some photos of them where they built like a sky bridge between two buildings, and they're just moving the equipment from one company to the other, from one building to the other. It's the same people, and so they actively go around, so I don't trust anything that they say, especially in these talks like you talked about with the tariffs, that they get to, essentially they want to enjoy the fruits of having a relationship with the United States, but none of the other things, right? And the sorts of unfair imbalance that exists between the U.S. and China, that has to end, right? And it has to, and I agree with you, there needs to be decoupling, but I almost feel like I mean, you may disagree with this. I'd love to get your thoughts, but that this is still too soft of an approach with the CCP and these negotiations, tariffs, whatever what angle you want to come at it from, but it still doesn't feel hardline enough. It still feels like we're giving you this little bit of trust, prove me wrong, even though there's all this other stuff going on over here that just shows exactly why you shouldn't trust anything that's coming out of their mouths, that you can't have a relationship with them. It's like you cannot separate the two people sitting at the table with Scott Besson and whoever else from the machinations of the entire CCP, so it just, I don't know. Do you think that Donald Trump is taking a hard enough stance in this, these negotiations and talks with, realigning our relationship with China?
I don't know if he totally understands the ideological problem and how the Chinese Communist Party has essentially leveraged a lot of the technology that the United States has created for the digital space, and really leverage it for their own advantage. So I think if you listen to the outtakes from those negotiations, one would get the impression that we would be perfectly fine if the Chinese just move their factories back to the United States, and we're making their products in the United States for the U.S. market. We would be perfectly happy with that, because we don't realize that. Okay, well that just gives them even more opportunities to undermine us from within. So we have to deal with this threat. We have to be able to create some separation from the Chinese Communist Party and American society, because of the centralization of narrative and economic power in our new economy. The tech companies are 25% of the S&P 500, enormous in economic power, almost like the railroads were during and the industrialists were during the Gilded Age, right? Just so much concentration of economic power in just a few tech companies who, by virtue of, a Google search, the algorithm is designed to basically show you the things that the algorithm shows you. There's no view to, hey, what did the algorithm not show me? And even AI now is being built with biases. The biases are already in our system. They're just looking at that, and they're essentially adopting the same biases. And it doesn't matter if you're deliberately trying to have unbiased AI. If they just look at our system, and you ask, so like what's your point of view about X? That point of view is informed by, most of the
Right.
content that's available on the internet. All of that
Correct.
stuff has been, essentially imbued with the narrative, the common narrative framework. And then, if you think of information consisting underneath a normal bell curve, and you think, well, all the crazies are on the outskirts of that bell curve, right? They're on the two standard deviations away from the norm, and then you
Mm-hmm.
say, okay, well, but the norm has actually been moved to the left quite significantly. So
Yeah. The
where
Overton
you would have
window.
typically been two standard deviations away from where is normal, you're probably somewhere in the heart of that bell curve, and unfortunately, you're missing it because somebody moved the norm. That is what we're dealing with in our society, and so what's a good example of this? Literally, 2 weeks after we started these lockdowns. This was a week actually after we started these lockdowns.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm like, holy crap! The Chinese are pulling one on us, and they are going to basically have us shut down our economy and
Right.
destroy our economy. Because of the way that they were messaging. And so I actually texted Steve Bannon at the time because I knew he was talking to the president. I'm like, you have got to let the president know that this is completely a psyop by the Chinese. And he's like, no, no, no. His buddy Miles Gore, the Chinese billionaire who is basically an MSS guy, he said, no, no. He says it's really bad in China. And I said, look at the numbers in Italy. If you
Right.
just look at the numbers, not forget about what China's saying. Look at because Italy was starting to spike then. If you
Mm-hmm.
look at the numbers in Italy, the people that are dying are very old with comorbidities.
Right.
No, literally nobody else is dying. So this is being blown out of proportion, and we need to get a handle on it. And of course, it just the Chinese were very effective, and the way that they were effective was not that was not I think as is commonly expected, which is propaganda. It was through a few relationships where another senior official within the administration was calling friends in China saying, "Hey, what's going on over there?" And the friends were saying, "Oh, it's really bad." Well, why were they saying it's really bad? Well, they were saying it's really bad because the Chinese Communist Party was hiding things, and so there
Right.
was this perception that it must be really bad because they're hiding things.
Yeah.
That's not the truth. And so what that senior official did was start coming into the White House and saying, hey, we've got a big problem. Everybody that I've talked to in China, all my friends have said it's really bad. And so it was through this, just a few people communicating to the White House that if you remember, and very early on, we were saying, look, it's not a pandemic. It is totally controllable. We have everything under control. And then all of a sudden it went over, and I was watching it from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, it's lost. And we lost. It ended up being, Steve Bannon and one other that essentially were able, because they had been convinced, not by the propaganda, but by personal relationships,
Mm-hmm.
who in those people could in their minds have believed that it was really bad in China, but um,
Sure.
because the Chinese Communist Party was hiding information, they had gotten bad data from their sources in China. That's why I say, when somebody says the Chinese government thinks this or the Chinese think that, I always immediately am skeptical, because you cannot believe a single thing that comes out of China. And the person telling you can absolutely be convinced with their own eyes that what they believe is true, but in reality, you have no idea. And I think what's hard for Americans to understand, so many things are leaked in our government.
Yeah.
But what kind of leaks do you typically not see in America? The type of leaks that you typically do not see in America are the leaks that come out of the private deliberations of the political parties themselves, right? Our government leaks like a sieve, right? But the political parties themselves don't leak. They're pretty disciplined on, in terms of, you understanding what Pelosi said to Schumer about how Biden, his cognitive state. Like, we can surmise, but do
Yeah.
we have any of that conversation? No. It's so, those political organizations are much more like the Communist Party in that they're highly secretive on internal party deliberations. Well, the Communist Party is like that on steroids because their device discipline, how they go about having their conclaves and their, absolute focus on ensuring that nobody brings a phone in or nobody brings a device in, and all of their deliberations are kept secret. That allows them to really then get their position. And because the Communist Party controls the entire government, the messaging that comes out of the government has already been approved by the party, and there's extreme discipline. And so I think, what COVID really represented was this really great psyop, because by holding party discipline, the Communist Party was able to control the narrative, and they controlled it in a way that allowed the people that were in the country that weren't necessarily privy to what actually was going on to inform the rest of the world. And, so there was a lot of effort by, the 50 Cent Army to convince us that it was bad. You remember the videos of people falling down in Wuhan, for example.
Yeah.
But
what
really mattered was the on-the-ground opinions of people who weren't in the know and were surmising because, of things they saw. But since they didn't have access to that internal party deliberation, we still don't. I mean, we have very, very few times when we can glimpse into the party. And those all happen to be based on factional disputes. If we don't have, if there's no kind of factional dispute, then you're not going to find out. And so in this case, we're likely, because of the nature of what happened with regard to COVID, we're never going to find out what the party actually thought about the pandemic and the threat, and what their approach was. And so, it is, this coupling, therefore, is a problem for us, because even when we're convinced, senior people that are convinced, people like me, like, if my eyes hadn't been opened, I would have probably, I cut off all contact with people in China when I left. I had friends there. I cut off all contact. I had a security clearance. I couldn't maintain that contact. But the people that do keep contact, so when anybody tells me, well, so and so from China told me something, then I immediately have to be skeptical, because I can't trust anything coming out of there. And that's kind of the problem that we have. We're coupled, and through these relationships, these personal relationships, oftentimes senior people are led astray because they believe these people are earnest, and they likely are earnest, but the Communist Party has total control over information in China.
Mm-hmm. Hearing you talk about it that way, it almost sounds like our politicians behave like they've got time to deal with this problem, because they're so focused on their internal squabbles, that they're too comfortable, too lax with the relation, or the way that they've existed over time, that they feel like they don't need to focus on the outside influence that really is controlling and manipulating them in so many different ways. One of the only I guess ways I've seen any politician or any government official really fight back against this, and is, you familiar with Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey at all?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you've probably seen his court cases he's had about COVID with the masks, and just sort of the way that like you said, the withhold of information that was coming out of China, and he's using it to go after Chinese owned land in the state of Missouri, and he's been successful with that, right? And I think that's outstanding. I wish more people would do that, but they pretend like they've got more time or that this isn't important, and it just kind of shows you the nature of politics in the United States is more about, our bottom line and what I care about with my party than it is securing the sort of unifying things that we have to keep in this country to realize, to keep our American identity safe without letting too much of this outside influence come in. And so there's that apathy as well, or almost, I would say, intentional ignorance to what's going on from the outside looking in. But I would like to kind of go into some of the asymmetric things that you talked about before and sort of paint this picture, how we first opened up ourselves to the Chinese, like within our history, and how we're still on bad footing with them. We still don't understand them, and our relationship with them sort of began that way as well. Really, with something as simple as a language barrier, right? And even having an interpreter communicating for you wasn't sufficient enough. And there's just the way, all these different things, right? And you're going to paint the picture much better than I am, but can we just sort of start there and go through when we first opened ourselves up to China, the sort of the mentality that we had at the time and how that's morphed throughout, from the Cold War to its ending and then now here, right?
Yeah, that's a really good book, and I probably have it back here somewhere. But it really goes all the way back to the British and the opening of China, the heroin trade, and within Shanghai there was even these concessions. I think we were constantly on the side of not promoting colonialism, and I think that was consistent with China as well. And our involvement with China has always been around this oil for the lamps of China. If you can sell to 1 billion Chinese, you're going to be successful. So it's always been
Right.
trade related, and it's never actually materialized. Like throughout our it probably goes back over 200 years. We have been off and on trying to open up the Chinese market for American commerce, and we just haven't been able to do so. It's never materialized, and I think that fascination, that huge population, has always, from a more or less a capitalist perspective, created this allure for America to basically sell there. And so you go all the way back to the Qing dynasty, which was the last dynasty in China. I mean, we were pursuing that dynasty, and then of course, there was this kind of interim period where you had the Japanese there, you had World War II, and then you had the Communist Party come to fore. There's this piece in there where the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek ran the country, and we had a very close relationship with them throughout World War II. But then as the communists came to power, all that ended, and more or less we're back to kind of the beginning, which is we thought we could get there in the market, and really all the Chinese Communist Party wanted, which is what the empires wanted, was in fact, even in the Qing dynasty, they said, we don't want anything, we have everything we need. So they're very they have been over their history very self-sufficient. So we've tried to figure out how to trade things. The only thing that anybody has ever figured out how to sell were the British, who figured out that they could sell them heroin, which was turned out, or excuse me, opium. So, and which turned out to be, obviously horrible. Consequently, if you think about now with fentanyl, the Chinese, there's this very common view in the Chinese Communist Party. Well, the West pushed the opium on us, we're pushing fentanyl on the
Right.
West. In reality, that wasn't us. That was technically the British. But
Right.
they don't. We're all in China. We're all Lao Wai. We're all foreigners. So whether it's British or Americans, we're all part of
Yeah.
the foreign problem. And so, but I'll have to I'll send you the book for and you can post with this podcast. But there's a really good book that talks about that history of economic trade with between the U.S. and China. It talks about the relationship too, and all the kind of important advances in the relationship, but that turned out to be really not very worthwhile for America. Obviously, very worthwhile for China, but I think it's been managed very well from the government side, whether it's been the emperor or the Communist Party.
Yeah. I always like to, when I'm trying to explain something to people, I like to use examples. I think that giving somebody something sort of tangible in their mind helps them understand things the best. We talked about asymmetric warfare and how they practice it, and the ways that they wage it aren't any way that we would think of, most people would think of warfare. Can we talk about a few examples from maybe a couple of different sectors, like the economic side? We've already discussed like the psychological side for sure. But just to sort of paint this picture, how even like the opium that you were talking about and fentanyl in the United States, it's like the Chinese opium war revenge tour on the West essentially is fentanyl. Even though the British Empire doesn't exist anymore, it's now the American Empire is the world's hegemon. But that's even a form of warfare to them, right? That the drug aspect of it, the TikTok is an aspect of it, controlling the mind. Like this isn't just like even an idea that is original to the Chinese Communist Party. Like this is the way that the Chinese have understood and protracted warfare for a long time, when they were still warring tribes essentially, and they write about this. They have this. It's been in their culture for thousands of years. Like this is nothing new. I even think too, recently with the whole trade war and tariffs, some people are just now finally learning about like the Belt and Road Initiative or BRICS, and think that this sort of quote unquote drama that Donald Trump has with China is all just Donald Trump and it's nothing else, and which is wrong on its face completely and totally. But maybe you could give us some examples of how that asymmetric warfare is waged and really just show the insidiousness of it, just to paint that picture so people really understand.
Yeah. So first of all, you have to understand that when we think of strategy, I know you're familiar with Clausewitz, the Prussian general, and he wrote on war, and he said war is a continuation of politics by other means. But he was really, talking about, the Western way of war. And then you have Jomini, who talked about, let's make war more or less scientific. Let's take the politics out of war. Just get from the political leader what the objective is, and then let the general go and prosecute the war. And so we have progressively moved down this path where we've treated war more or less like medicine. And what I mean by that, well, in Chinese medicine, you look holistically at the person. What's your sleep like? What's your diet like? What do you do like day to day in your work? And then how does all of that contribute to what ails you? You're coming in because your foot hurts. They don't just look at your foot; they look at everything. Whereas here in the West, it's like you go to a podiatrist to look at your foot, right? And that's what they look at. They look at your foot. They specialize on your foot. Well, if you think about what Matt has said, it's all about lethality. You take Clausewitz and Jomini, and then you get to this point where I want to apply this weapon at this point to achieve this military goal. And then, but when you look at, and this is totally true for me, when you look at how does what our political necessities, our realities are, and the political outcomes we need with this vis-a-vis this country, how does that military outcome actually lead to what we want here politically? And if you the more specialized we become in the military, the less connected we've become to the purpose of the military act. It's all about, like as Matt said, it's all about lethality. In other words, don't worry about what the political reasons are we're going to war. Just worry about how do you get much better at being a specialist at killing and breaking things. And so that is strategically, thinking, in terms of war. There's a completely different view, and that view is that war is all political. So, as Mao would say, so you take Clausewitz. War is a continuation of politics by other means. In other words, we use military force to achieve a political outcome. What Mao said is that war is politics with bloodshed, while politics is war without bloodshed. And what do we want?
Right.
We want politics. We want war without bloodshed, which is politics. And so, they actually focus on what is the political outcome we're trying to achieve. War may be a tool, but it is like so far down the path because it carries with it risk, right? And so the strategic kind of orientation of Chinese leaders is like to be anti-conflict, because conflict carries with it risk. So first of all, that's number one. Then when you think about it from how we approach a problem, it's also different. In fact, we will say, I'm gonna achieve this objective, and therefore, we gather our resources, we have a goal, and then we go out and achieve that goal. That's kind of the Western way of thinking about how you achieve. You have strategies to achieve an objective. The Chinese are different. They will look at, where is the world going? Like, what is the major trends in the world? How do I adapt? So in the West, we're trying to change the world to wrap it around us, right? We're trying to mold the world in the image we want. But the Chinese are different. They want to mold them. So like, what's the world? What are the trends? How do I change myself to take advantage of those trends and then be carried along by them? And so doctrinally, we have doctrine in the West, and Chinese have doctrine. That book, War Without Rules, that I wrote was really explaining Chinese doctrine for war. And that doctrine is, what are the trends? The trends are globalization. The trends are the internet. We're becoming more and more connected economically and informationally. Okay, how do I adapt myself to take advantage of these two things, globalization and the internet, so that I can get the results I want? Understanding that politics is war without bloodshed and war is politics with bloodshed. And I would rather have the former than the latter. And then they come up with, okay, well, we want to structure our society so that people are incentivized to do things that are in our political interest. Okay, what does that mean? In the case of fentanyl, we know, number one, that our people need jobs, because if they don't have jobs, we will be run out of town. So we want to make sure that they have maximum incentive to get wealthy, right? We want to implant in them, get wealthy, but do it in the way that supports the Chinese Communist Party interests. In other words, if we tell you to do, you can do whatever you want, but these things you should not do, absolutely don't do those things or you're going to get whacked. And so in the case of fentanyl, what is the game? Well, the game is get rich. Do it by any means possible. Okay, well, precursors for fentanyl, I can have that make a lot of money in America selling fentanyl. Does the Communist Party care about that? Absolutely not. Great. More Americans dead? That's better for us. But here's the deal. You will not sell that here in China. So you think, okay, all the precursors come from China. They end up as fentanyl in the rest of the world. And the U.S. is the biggest market and most profitable market.
Right.
So the Chinese Communist Party is basically sending those precursors to the cartel and the triads out of Hong Kong. And then they make their way either through Canada or Mexico or directly from China into our country. So so then you go to the intelligence community, who's then very focused on kind of our way of thinking. Well, if this was really a strategy of the Chinese, then Xi Jinping would have had this plan, and that would have been given out to all of these companies to make these precursors and to sell them, and their goal would have been explicitly stated that, hey, we want to sell fentanyl to the Americans. That, again, that's an American way of thinking about the problem. What you have to think of is, okay, the Chinese Communist Party does not have a fentanyl problem in China, but they have a huge fentanyl problem in America. Why is that? The Chinese Communist Party has total political control over the country, and that leads to outcomes and behaviors that the Chinese Communist Party wants. One of those outcomes or behaviors is there's not a fentanyl problem in China because the people making the precursors and the fentanyl aren't selling it in China. But when our agencies go to China and say, can you help us with this fentanyl problem? And they're like, we don't have a fentanyl problem. And,
right.
And they say, well, okay, the precursors, and as you probably know, you can make a small chemical change to fentanyl. And all of a sudden it's no longer on the schedule of illegal drugs in America.
Right.
And then, so they'll come in and say, hey, you guys, your chemist came up with a new formulation. Can you basically make it illegal?
Wow.
And they'll say, okay, well, maybe 6 or 12 months we can make it illegal. We got to get it through the process and everything. Meanwhile, then they go and change it again. And so we start to look at the problem as a criminal problem within China. In other words, it is something for the FBI or the DEA to go after and prosecute, and then they have to get cooperation from China, rather than taking a step back and saying, okay, well, this is actually systemic. The Chinese Communist Party could shut this down if they wanted to, but it benefits them because, the people making the precursors make money and Americans die. And so while the Communist Party isn't absolutely directing them to do it, they're benefiting from that trade. And so, so when I say, okay, how do you deal with that problem? Actually, what Trump did with the tariff war is the way you deal with it, right? You say, how do I make sure that not a single good flows from China to the United States, because that will put pressure on the Chinese economy. Mm-hmm. What happened? What did I say that the Chinese Communist Party want? They want their people to have jobs, or else they're not going to be in business. They're going to be overthrown. So once you start to turn those ships around, now the Communist Party is afraid. All of a sudden, you've got their attention. Okay, I've got your attention. I will not let a single ship dock in America with your stuff if a single shipment of fentanyl comes with the origin from China. And that will get their attention. If you try to treat it like we've been treated as a criminal enterprise, so you have to treat it like a war. It is a war. This is their doctrine for war is what are the trends? Globalization. I can freely trade in America. The internet. I've got control over all the channels of narratives into the country. how do I take advantage of that? Well, in this case, I take advantage of it through the fentanyl trade. My people make money and Americans die. And, we more or less don't see that as warfare. So here you have, in just fentanyl, you have the conundrum, which is as long as we stay coupled, as long as goods flow, and as long as we, don't. So actually shutting down, people were flying over the ports of Long Beach and the other ports, and they were completely empty, over the last several weeks because of the tariffs, right? It was shut down. And China's economy collapsing, absolutely collapsing. So, and so they, of course, all of these companies like Dollar Tree are selling this crap from China. They're saying, well, all my crap's going to stop flowing now because of these tariffs. I'm going to go out of business. And so they're all clamoring to the administration to turn the flow of goods back on. Meanwhile, as you turn the flow of goods back on, you turn the flow of fentanyl back on. So this is a conundrum that it's a policy problem, and it's an enigma that you realize that you have to basically understand what the Chinese did. They used globalization and the internet as their way to attack the country, and because they have become so much a part of our economy, because they are the manufacturer of the world, we're almost it's almost like the addict, right? You can't stop taking the drug because you're addicted to it. But it's killing you, and you can't stand the withdrawal pain that comes from taking the drug out of your vein. So you just keep, even though it's killing you, you just keep doing it, and that's what we're doing. And fentanyl is a perfect example. And so when I make an analogy of this, I say, okay, here's an analogy. Here's a way to think about the problem. Your dad comes to you and says, "Hey, son, we've got an anthill in the backyard that we need to get rid of. I need you to go get rid of the anthill." And so you go out in the backyard and you set up an ambush point and you start stomping ants as they come by the ambush point. Maybe you put some corn out and feed, and you're just killing ants all day long. Your dad comes home and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And you're like, and this the FBI and DEA will tell you this, right? We've got 100% effectiveness. We have, we killed 500 ants today. We killed, it's like we captured, 18 tons of fentanyl. Like we're just taking fentanyl off the street. I'm killing ants. Your dad goes out in the backyard and like, the anthill's still there.
Right.
You say, well, yeah, but I was 100% affected. Yeah, but you didn't do what I said. Get rid of the anthill. So, it is one of these things of perception and process and understanding from a strategic perspective how to actually look at the problem as a systemic problem, not just a problem for law enforcement. We do not have enough FBI and DEA agents to prosecute a war on fentanyl where we're just going to try to lock up Chinese or cartel or triad people as we catch them. There's too many Chinese for that, right? They'll just throw more Chinese at it because they're making money and the government doesn't care. You have to have a systemic answer, which is no goods will flow as long as the fentanyl flows. And I think that's how you have to start to think about this problem. That's just one example.
No, that's a great example, because earlier you were talking about looking at this like medicine, right? All we're doing is treating the symptoms. It's just symptom management. It's not actually going after the problem. If you've got a headache because there's, something, you got a blockage in your brain, well, taking Motrin for that isn't going to actually help you, right? Maybe it kills the pain for a little bit, but the problem still exists. So your addict analogy is perfect too, because the other half of that problem about the Chinese pumping fentanyl into the United States is that Americans want to buy it and they want to use it, right? So we have a moral and ethical issue here in the United States too, because it's the same thing. It's the same reason why Pablo Escobar was so successful, right? Americans have an appetite for drugs, and that's just a massive problem. There will always be that problem as long as Americans are buying drugs and using them, right? So that's an issue that we have to deal with and reconcile as well. You and I aren't going to get to the bottom of that problem here today.
Well, I mean, but the Chinese Communist Party will look at it and say, that's exactly right. You guys have a problem.
Right.
Well, then you can say, well, China, why all this stuff is being produced in China? explain to me why you don't have a problem. And the answer is because if they know that if they sell fentanyl in China, we're going to kill them. And we know exactly where they are. We know exactly who's doing it, and we can shut it down at any time. Like, in that is the grain of truth that you're looking for. So the party knows who's doing it. They can stop it at any time. It is not America's fault because we're buying these drugs. It's where it's being produced.
Yeah, no, you're right. Kind of what I was getting at is if people just didn't buy that shit or use it, right, then there would be no market to sell it to. But I mean, now we're just talking about human nature anyway, right?
Well, yeah. So good point. So I was talking to what was the Attorney General of one of the states when I was at the White House, and her husband was an orthopedic surgeon, and a pregnant woman comes in. They do a blood test, and she's got you got fentanyl in your blood. And she's like, well, I just smoked pot. The problem is that that this drugs are being cut with fentanyl across the spectrum, right? So to make it more potent. And so, you may not be intending to take fentanyl. I mean, that's why we have people that die. Like, you may not even be intending to take fentanyl. Guess what? Your drugs are laced with fentanyl. And so, so because it's so powerful, with just a small amount, these dealers are basically using it to make their stuff more effective. And, that's how it's not, so you're not just buying fentanyl, you're buying other drugs where fentanyl has been added.
Yeah, no, that's pretty terrifying. Cause I mean, I live in, California right now. It's legal to smoke marijuana here. I don't smoke marijuana, but I know that there are a lot of people around me who do, have friends and family members who do. So to hear that, you can go and you buy pot from somebody, your dealer, whatever, and that weed is laced with fentanyl is pretty scary. That should be a wake up call to some people, you would think. But just kind of curious, to talk to you about how much do you know about like the PLA? That we have a conversation about like capes, the capabilities between like what the PLA and maybe the PLAN are doing, and the Air Force too. They have the goofy acronyms, PLAAF and all this stuff. But versus the United States military, that's a hot topic. A lot of people, I think, feel like the Chinese are surpassing the United States in certain ways, or at least on par, right? We've sort of changed our mindset about it's not near peer anymore, it's peer to peer. How much of that is true? And then, like, are we able to have a conversation about some of the differences in the way like the PLA operates and the U.S. military operates?
Well, I mean, they're getting way more capable, but I'll take you to the military doctrine of mass. Let's say I put you on a battlefield with a modern machine gun.
Okay.
And it's it's the Revolutionary War, and you've got 500 rounds of ammo, and you're looking across the field, and there's 1,000 soldiers. Now you can mow down 500 soldiers, but guess what? As soon as you're out of ammo, those other 500 are going to kill you. And that's the problem we face today, is one of mass. And mass not just in the number of ships and planes and tanks, but mass in just the number of ammunition and amount of ammunition. They have stockpiled so much ammunition in China. They're putting out ships, airplanes, tanks to the tune of just so... And our shipyards are gone. They're broken. We put out a ship, not very often. Planes, the same thing. Weapons, even worse. Our throughput of weapons, there is no way we can sustain any war for maybe more than a couple of days. We've given a lot of our munitions to Ukraine for the war there. Chinese are happy because we're expending all of our munitions. We're giving them to Ukraine. And meanwhile, they're stockpiling. So so they are becoming more capable, but I try to remind people it doesn't matter how capable you are if everybody goes Winchester and on blue side, and everybody in red still has ammo, right?
Yep.
How effective are you going to be in a battleship or in a submarine or in a fighter or a bomber or in a tank with no ammunition, and your enemy
Right.
is full of ammunition? And that's the chance. And I've got one jet and fighter, and they've got 20 or 30. That's
Right.
so. Doctrine, I think informs us on what's going to happen in these things, and we're not even thinking about the doctrine of mass. We've become so, I don't think, influenced by the wars in the Middle East, and it's this whole thing where we almost read our own, and believe our own press clippings about how good we are as a military. It doesn't matter if your opponent has more mass than you do. And what I'm telling you right now is the Chinese have so much more mass. It's not even like a little bit more mass. Like we've got a little pile, and their pile is like over this roof.
Right.
They're not like, they can take it. Taiwan is one of the things we like to talk about. They can make Taiwan look like the surface of the moon, and not even put a dent in their stockpiles. And so, it's the whole premise of how the U.S. is going to be able to counter the PLA. We're not even close. We can't. We absolutely can't. And it's not just because they're becoming more capable. Is that the mass is just, the numbers are overwhelming in their advantage. And then, not to mention that once we start shooting, who knows when the first nuke gets cracked off, which nobody wants that. So anyway, that's my view on it. Mass is always going to kill you if the adversary has the advantage. In this case, they have the advantage.
Yeah, that's not a good answer, or it's a good answer, but that's not the answer people would want to hear, I guess I should say, right? And again, why?
But it's when anybody can understand, right? If I come to your house and I've got 1,000 rounds of ammo and you've got 100,
it is.
Guess what? I'm coming through your front door.
Right.
You're not going to stop me.
Yeah.
It's just common sense.
Absolutely. And there's a mindset problem too. And I'll give you a small anecdote that I use on the podcast here. I was having a conversation. This was several years ago with a senior leader in my unit, and we were having a disagreement about the way to essentially instill resilience in airmen. I'll put it that way, right? And we got on the topic of the Chinese because it's something that that we're trying to focus on, right? They were trying to shift our mentality, and I made a comment about how what would you rather have, a group of people who are strong and mentally resilient, or people who you tell it's okay all the time and you don't need to improve, like if we go to war? And we're having this fundamental disagreement, which just seems absolutely asinine and insane, that I'm having this conversation with somebody and they're trying to tell me the exact opposite of everything I'd learned over the past 15 years. And so she says to me, she goes, I don't know why you're so bothered by this, because the next world war is going to be a cyber war. And the first thing I said to her, I said, well, what is a cyber war? And can't give me an answer. I'm like, well, like, genuine question. I'm like, do you really think that at no point, if there's, this cyber war, that it would ever be boots on the ground? And she goes, I'm sure you're right. And I was like, okay, so then what would you rather have? And I asked her, like, did you know that there are cables that run under the ocean that keep the internet on? And this was right after the Nord Stream pipeline thing. I was like, think about that. If somebody goes, and obviously this has happened, and I've like juiced myself up a little bit a few times because I've told this story in the podcast about how that's actually happened now. I was like, imagine them cutting internet cables, and they're going around and doing this, and they have ships that can cut cables. And I was like, have you ever thought about the fact that if there is no internet, there is no cyber war, and then at the end of the day, it's just boots on the ground, mano a mano again? And it didn't go well for me from that point, because I think I upset her and made her feel made her feel dumb. But it is dumb, and I'm out now, so I'm going to say that. This is one of the stupidest conversations I've ever had with a senior non-commissioned officer in the military. But it's just one of the things you've been talking about this whole time is mindset and perception and the way we think about these things. And it just I feel like, you ever seen that? I don't remember the name of the movie. The guy, he goes around, he keeps putting the sunglasses on, and he sees the world for what it really is, right? And that's kind of how I felt in a lot of ways, walking around and just in my experience in the Air Force, I guess, dealing with people that just didn't think this was a big deal, and looking at some of the the decisions people were making. And I had a commander's call one time for the wing, and the wing commander, I won't say what base this was at because I don't know if the guy's still serving. But he told me, told this group of E5s and E6s that airmen now view the military as just like a job anywhere else, at Target or whatever, and they just want to clock in and clock out and go home, and that's okay, right? And so, like, there's all these other AFSCs in the room. I'm security forces, right? There's a lot less of that, obviously, just with shift work, and maintainers get it as well, and pilots too, certainly. But you're instilling this idea that the military is just a job, and you're telling supervisors in this room, impressionable 22, 23, 24-year-olds, that it's just a job and it's okay. And it's just like, dude, like, to your point, you can have all these cool weapons in the world. You can have, lasers and rail guns, and the F-35 has got this amazing upgrade and all this other stuff. Well, if no one cares, everybody thinks it's just a job, then just because you've got that cool OCP uniform on, it doesn't mean shit. You may as well just be playing at life. This isn't reality. And that's how, to me, it's like, yeah, cool, we got all this tech, but like nobody cares. So what, it doesn't matter that if you're in a Lamborghini, and I'm in a Corolla, if you don't know how to drive a stick shift in your Lamborghini, I'm going to beat you in a race every day. You know what I mean? So that's the biggest thing to me, is watching just people's mindsets not even be close to where it should be, because nothing else matters at that point. People have to care.
Yeah, I think, I've had a lot of time to kind of reflect on my military service. And I think one of the things that we pay lip service to, and that is something that I think we shouldn't pay lip service to, is the Constitution. I think you have to swear an oath to the Constitution. Mm-hmm. But increasingly, towards the end of my career, I really started to realize that most people in the military didn't actually know what the Constitution said.
For sure.
And I'll just give an example of, I remember this Army captain asking me about, what the president says versus, policy. And I said,
gotcha.
We have a single national referendum in America. There's only one position that every American votes for, and that is for president of the United States. And so, and then in the Constitution, the Constitution places all executive authority in that single person. And so, you start to run into this where there's this belief that this agency or that, or this cabinet secretary or that, is where power is derived from. And no, the power is in the single executive who has been chosen by the American people. In other words, the way that we remain free is the American people decide what our policy is, and they decide that when they elect a president. And then that president, is subject to the powers that are in the legislative branch and the judicial branch. But I really believe that probably the best thing that the military could do as an institution, and you asked me about kind of what can we do against China. I think one thing we could do is to use the time that people are in the military to, give them a real understanding of the thing that they are taking an oath to support and defend, and have a constant a constant reiteration, because we have all this PME, whether you're officer or enlisted, we go through all this
Yeah.
PME, you learn all these things, but what you don't do, you're kind of expected by virtue of the fact you grew up in America, you know what the Constitution means. But then we've stopped teaching the Constitution
Yeah. Most
in
of his
in the
classes.
classroom. And so I think the best thing that you could do from a military standpoint is basically teach the Constitution, reinforce that teaching through all PME, reinforce it, on an annual, like we do anti-terrorism CBT. Do a
Right.
Constitution CBT, for God's sakes. Make
Sure.
sure that when that person leaves the military, whether they retire or separate, that when they leave, they understood why they took an oath, what they were going to support and defend, and then they could come out, and when they got out, they would be far more educated and understanding, what are the intrinsic suppression of rights that have grown out of the increasing power of the administrative state. And they would be the best advocates for the Constitution of the United States, because they would have been taught it, reinforced it during their time in the military. And quite frankly, it's good because they take an oath to support and defend it. This is why we're here.
It's in the
We're
words.
here defending this piece of paper, and this piece of paper says these things that, and when you're out and you're a civilian, you can look at the world and you can say, okay, these things that we say, we're not actually abiding by them in a lot of cases, and you need to be able to call it out. And if somebody puts you in jail because you called out the fact that you're not supported, that we're not following the Constitution, then we have a tyranny. And quite frankly, that's what's been going on. So
It has been.
I honestly think that the best immunization for the country would be to take military service and force everybody that does it to be experts on the Constitution by the time they leave.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. And I don't remember, or I'm not sure when you retired, but the extremism stand down in the military, I'm sure you remember, or at least heard about it, whether you lived through it or not. But what you're just talking about, the Constitution, I had there's a staff sergeant that worked for me who used to carry around a pocket Constitution, and he would bring it out. We would stand in line at the armory, and sometimes he would just bring it out and just start like reading from it, kind of like it was a Bible. It was kind of funny. It used to crack me up. But I had a senior NCO tell him to put it back in his pocket and stop doing that, and basically chastise him, and had this conversation about how like just some people don't want to hear that. And it's like, okay, like there's a difference between saying like, okay, you're being distracting, and then like we're just all in line waiting to arm up to post, right? And he's doing this, and I said to this guy, I was like, that the oath we take when we enlist, it says to support and defend the Constitution. Like if you're serving and you don't want to hear about the Constitution, then I have bad news for you, right? And then, like during the extremism stand down, I had my commander telling us, well, you need to go through dorm rooms and you need to go look around parking lots, and you're looking for, American historical iconography and things like that need to come off of vehicles, right? No Gadsden flags, no appeal to heaven flags, all these things that are American history, right? And it's just like, what are we doing, right? Like we're replacing all of these traditional American things with bullshit. And you're probably familiar with the idea of semantic overload, right? And how you're changing the meanings of words. It's like you're changing the purpose of the Air Force. We have or the military in general, like my service is the Air Force, but we have all these clubs, right? And all of these different groups. You go walk around, maybe like the hospital on base, and you see all these signs and the boards and stuff like that about this club and that club, and like that becomes the purpose of your service now. Is like, well, I went to the LGBT club and that's my thing, and then I'm gonna in the middle of the duty day, then I'm gonna go over to the Pacific Islander group and get lumpia and stuff like that. It's like, okay, well, what did you do all day? That's this mindset, and I blame too like the promotion thing, and now we're getting like super niche, right? Because EPRs and OPRs sort of favor that sort of crap, really. But that's what it's been replaced with, is this like sort of self-aggrandizement and the rewriting of what it means to serve. It's all now, how fast can I promote? What can I do to make myself look better? And there's none of this, well, how can we make what we're doing better? How can we get better at how we're taking care of our jobs here? How can we defend this country better? There's none of that conversation. It's just crazy to see, because I joined in 2010, okay, and that was kind of right before all of that, the stuff that happened at Lackland with the trainees and the TIs and stuff like that. And for me, and I know every generation says this, okay, like I'm well aware, like my dad is also a veteran, and he's like, back when I was serving, the Gulf War, it's like, yes, I get it, we're all pussies now, right? But there is a marked change, and there was a marked change that I could see, especially I was at Malmstrom at the time, and nuclear security is much different than anything else, law enforcement or regular security, whatever you're doing, so that the standard is definitely higher. But I watched that change as well, and to me, that was like one of the biggest turning points, I think, for a lot of the crap that we see now. You had General Welsh, they're pretty darn good with the morale, the button that people were pressing, to retire, get out quicker, all of these things, it just, there's so much mismanagement, I think, too, in an organization that is a top-down organization that has really allowed a lot of the stuff we've been talking about to fester. It needs this sort of total overhaul that, definitely Donald Trump is telling like Pete Hegseth and these other people to do. I think it's absolutely necessary, and it's coming almost, too late, I feel, or fear, I guess. I mean, what would do you agree? Like, do you think that, this is the right way to go about that, or what?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the things I didn't talk about is, I've been looking at China for a long time, and the part of my writing Stealth War and writing War Without Rules was, how do I take what I've learned about China and give back to the country, but then as you start to think about, like, what do we do, like how do we position ourselves to be to support the continuation of our constitutional republic. And then I start to look at what's going on, is what's being manifest in our society, and really, see it accelerate during COVID with this, censorship, and then critical race theory, DEI, all of these things. I'm like, what is going on? And so I had to educate myself. And so understanding what's the origin of DEI and critical race theory. I think a good book on that is Cynical Race, or Cynical Theories. It's actually written by a conservative and a liberal, right? So these two people on opposite sides of the political aisle, and before they wrote the book, they wrote a series of academic papers, like 17 papers. They submitted those papers to peer-reviewed academic journals. That's awesome. And like 7 or 10 of those 17 papers, can't remember the numbers, got accepted and published in these peer-reviewed journals. And the papers themselves were complete and utter bullshit. They had just made it up. Yeah. But they'd used the terms. And so, and then after those papers were published, they said, look, we just made these papers up. They're complete bullshit, and we're using your terms. And so then they wrote the book Cynical Theories to explain the origin of critical race theory and DEI. And it really comes from French philosophers, and it's more or less Marxism. And so when you look at kind of the infiltration throughout our university system, and it really, I think it became very apparent to, it was apparent to mostly conservatives, I think, what was happening in the university system, but what was not apparent, it was not apparent to the liberal. So it was more or less apparent to Republicans, not apparent to Democrats. And then October 7th happened.
Right.
And the horrific, attacks the burning and killing of babies and rape and just, I mean, absolutely the most brutal things that you could ever imagine happen. And
Right.
then you have the rise of Hamas on our university campuses,
Oh, yeah.
protesting the Israeli response to this
Columbia.
brutalization. And now the liberals said, I've been donating to Harvard. I've been donating to Yale and Columbia University.
Yeah.
And these guys are basically supporting these horrific things. And and you come to find out that, the things that you were supporting, actually relish brutality. And so you just double down. You say, okay, well, it doesn't exist. October 7th didn't happen. It's all made up. And so what they realize, what the left realize now, and a lot of very prominent people on the left, people like Bill Maher, a good example of complete liberal, but understands now what's going on. It is Marxism, and Marxism has jumped from the university system. So all those
They've graduated
that were taught in Yale and Harvard now working in the corporate sector. So they brought all of that with them. They become part of the hiring practices in the corporate sector.
Right.
Oh, by the way, DOJ, FBI, DOD, people, civilians, and military coming into these agencies
the
and bringing those belief systems in. So now you start to see, and that really the acceleration happened, I believe, after George Floyd, the BLM riots, and COVID. It just it's all of a sudden Marxist. It became warp speed. It was like Marxism on amphetamines. And so now I think people and it took not even something happening in America, something happening in Israel for people, and then the response in America that was completely counterintuitive for people on the left now to realize. And so now what we have is the Chinese Communist Party, completely Marxist, the what I would call the fringe now on the Democratic side that are completely Marxist. And there's an alignment between those two. And what you're seeing happen within the corporate sector, the financial sector, the military, right? The stand down for extremism was a part of that. All of that's being slowly peeled back now. Where it goes from here, and does it continue beyond the next 4 years? I don't know. But I think if we can continue kind of the understanding of why it needs to be rolled back, that it is counter to the Constitution, that it is imbued, it is basically Marxist at its core.
It is. You're right.
Then I think we'll be okay. And then I think being able to rid ourselves intellectually in this country of those things, by the way, that gave easy ammunition to the Chinese Communist Party. I don't know if you remember, but when Biden came in office, they had Blinken and whoever the Chinese person was met in Alaska. What did the Chinese say? You guys are a racist country. So they're basically taking the DEI talking points that we were saying to each other and said, okay, piling on top, you guys are a racist country. And what do you say to that when that's your beliefs? You're like, yes, we're a racist country.
Right.
Well, then China would say, well, but we're not a racist country. You are. By the way, they're very racist if you've lived there. So, so anyway, I think we are beginning to peel back a lot of these things that are really counter to our history, counter to the Constitution. Things like racial based hiring. Same thing was happening in the military in terms of promotion instructions for promotion boards. And being a merit-based society that is essentially colorblind is what we, when we say in the Constitution, in order to form a more perfect union, there's a recognition that we're not there yet. But this is where we should be headed. We should be headed to a merit-based society where, doesn't matter what you look like or where you come from. Everybody gets a fair shot. I think we have been reversing that at warp speed, since the BLM riots and COVID. But now it's started. I think it's peaked it feels like we're starting to go back down the other side. And the U.S. military, being a manifestation of everything else that's going on in our society, seems to be doing the same thing. And so I think more or less that's a positive thing. Restoring all of those people that were fired because they refused to take the injection. I told my son, don't take the shot. You don't need it. First of all, you're not 55 or over 55 with comorbidities. There's no reason you should take it. And I refused when it came out. I said, I'm not going to take it. I don't need it. I'm healthy. I'm not elderly, and I already had COVID. So you want to? It's like you want to give me a vaccination or inoculation against something I've already had, which I've already therefore built up the immunity to. And then like, well, that's not the same as getting vaccinated. The immunity from vaccination. What planet are you on? This is all I've ever learned. Is the whole reason you have vaccinations, because you don't want to take the actual polio virus and eat it. That would be stupid. But if you if you can survive COVID because you had it, now you have built up immunity for it. And the fact that everybody was disagreeing that was a thing during this time, you could just see, okay, we're just completely rife with propaganda, and there's no critical thinking going on whatsoever.
Yeah. No, earlier when you were talking about just people continuing to do business with the Chinese and the way we haven't changed our mindset, it's you're familiar with the Gell-Mann amnesia effect? No. So the Gell-Mann amnesia effect is essentially this. It's this effect where you have this information about a specific subject and you understand it, right? And we use the news very often to describe this and analogize it. You read an article that was in the news, because you have all this information about the subject, that the information in the article is inaccurate, okay? But then you continue reading the periodical or whatever you're reading, and you read something else that maybe you don't know a lot about, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. And you take that information and then as fact, even though right before that you had discredited it because you had that information. Well, it's sort of the same thing where like you've learned from, and you have all this evidence from experience that you should not trust the Chinese, right? And you should not do that. But you're moving forward by saying, okay, well, this time it'll work, and I'm going to trust the new information, this information I'm being given from this person because it's different or whatever. And sort of that same thing, that Gell-Mann amnesia effect, I think, exists as well. And all of this that you're talking about with the Marxist ideology coming in with DEI principles and the university systems, people still look at the university systems as like, well, that you need that, and we need this in our country because degrees matter. And it's like, to an extent, it's like, yes, like I want people going to school. I want people going to Cal Polytechnic because we need engineers in this country. But at the same time, like, these other universities you're talking about, like Yale, Harvard, Columbia, that have been totally indoctrinated with this Marxist ideology, and they take money from these Chinese think tanks that exist in the United States only just to brainwash Americans, and still assign all of this gravitas to them, like these degrees these people are walking out with, matter. And it made me think that to ask you this question, but there are a lot of Chinese students in the United States. And, I live out here in California. There are a ton of Chinese students, like at places like Stanford or Cal Polytechnic, any of the UCs that you can think of, and these people, they do come and, they provide value. And when they kind of come out and work for any place like in Silicon Valley, but then they leave and then they go back to their country. You're well aware of this problem, obviously. My question to you then would be is like, do we rewrite the terms of like the H1B visa? I think that's what it is, the student visa, or I could be wrong. So I won't use that term. So the student visas we give these countries to come in, should we rewrite that and not allow them to come in? Or basically sort of make it some sort of obligation, sort of like military service, but like if you're going to live here, that you're not allowed to go back to your country of origin and take all of this information you've learned and the experiences you've had with our tech sector or whatever, and you have to apply that here in the United States, and you have to use the knowledge you gain in the United States to make the United States better.
Yeah. So, by the way, I don't know if you saw recently, Stanford students put out a report that that there's Chinese spies all over Stanford,
Yeah.
which I was very happy to see. Student journalists actually, they did the investigation and said, okay, well, yeah, we're full of Chinese spies, and gave examples of it. And I thought that was great, because what that tells you, if the students are doing that, then we're starting to have this. There's an effect where the pendulum swung too far, and the students are like, they've started to like wake up to what's going on. It's kind of like a Neo, when he gets shot and then he wakes up and he can see the Matrix. People are starting to see the Matrix. I think it's a good thing. The students, I gave you the example of, social media where they're on WeChat in China and they come here and they stay on WeChat. There is no way that you're going to get through to a Chinese student in 4 years in a way that actually makes that interaction a benefit for the United States, right? There's no way you're going to do that. They are still on their social media. 90% of the time they're speaking Chinese with the other Chinese students who, by the way, are watching each other and reporting on each other. Now, are there a handful of people that genuinely, are curious and change their point of view or get affected by their time in America? Absolutely. Happens all the time. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't happen at scale. You may get out of 100 students, 2 or 3 that happens to. So in the meantime, you've got threats from 97 to 98 of those students, because they're taking the information back. They're stealing things because they're told to. They're spying for the government because by law they have to. And so, I absolutely believe that we should not issue a single student visa to a Chinese student. What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to teach the enemy? Okay, well, then give them student visas. Are you trying to change the perception of the Chinese people through interaction and these student exchanges? If that's the goal, then stop. Do not do it, because you can't. The Chinese government had them from the time they were born, from the time they got into kindergarten to the time they went to university in America. They have been fed a steady diet of propaganda throughout their 18 years of life, and their media that they take with them, their WeChat, they're in their phones. It's all going to be there for the entire 4 years of there. So you can tell them America's a democracy, and what they're going to think when you're saying that is, yeah, you've been brainwashed. America's not a democracy. It's an authoritarian hegemon. It bullies the rest of the world. It's a racist place. It is, it's a modern Sodom and Gomorrah, completely immoral. So all of these things, these messages that the Chinese Communist Party tells them about America so when you interact with them, what they're hearing is, okay, here's somebody trying to convince me, either one, this person's stupid, like they don't know their own country because they've been brainwashed, or 2, they're trying to brainwash me, and I know that therefore they're a spy. So these are the 2 thoughts that go into their head. So why invite them over? Because there's going to be absolutely zero benefit to the United States by having it in their country. And in fact, it creates a risk by allowing them to report on the country, to take things they learn back, and actually make China better on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. It's not even on behalf of the Chinese people. They are making China better for the Chinese Communist Party, full stop.
Yeah. No, I don't disagree. The last couple of years I was at Travis, And there were quite a few new airmen I saw running around, Travis, who were Chinese, and quite a few of them, any of them I had to interact with, whether it's at like, MPE or whatever, spoke very broken English. And I was really shocked to see that. And, it didn't make any sense to me. It's, I'm sure that, and I don't know the rules, right? Maybe some of these recruits, they're coming in, they're not allowed to go into specific AFSCs or whatever because of their background. I don't know. But it just, the same thing that you were talking about with students, to me, it made almost no sense to, and it felt like a threat more than anything to let them come into the military, because like at the end of the day, like it doesn't matter if you work in finance, you're gonna make friends with an airman at the dorm who is a 1-0 or an intel guy, right? And then maybe you're gonna have a conversation. And so there's all these ways that information gets proliferated around and then makes its way back to places it shouldn't go. But we're pushing.
Well, and they've caught these guys spying too. Like they're just, it's been in the news the last few months of catching enlisted people that were Chinese spying. Oh my gosh!
Shocker! Right? Yeah,
shocker.
Yeah. Did you hear about that Navy recruiting station in Southern California that was using WeChat with Chinese recruits? You heard about that? Yeah. I don't know. To me, it's just like, I don't know how you guys are still recruiters anymore. The fact that, you didn't at least get AJP or court-martialed for crap like that. I don't understand. That, like, with 110% is a national security threat for you to be doing that. That when I saw that, I couldn't believe it. And it was encouraged by Navy leadership too, which I thought was just insane. It's like you're going to market yourself as this like friendly, cuddly teddy bear to these Chinese students, but we're gonna use WeChat and all this other stuff to talk to you. And it's just it's this total Marxist way of thinking about dealing with people that you were talking about. Like this is not going to work nor end well for us, right? At the end of the day, we've had a lot of doom and gloom kind of coming up on the 2-hour mark. Where do you think in any way the United States has an advantage and is doing the right thing with competing with China, with interacting with China, that is pushing us towards an outcome that is favorable as the United States?
I think as long as we are here, I think we have a chance. I have up here that thing right there. That is a technology that we've developed. We've been working on it for about 6 years.
Okay.
And it hardens our telecommunication and cloud infrastructure against things like EMP and tamper and zero trust, and so it's meant to protect our data.
Right.
And it's unique, and we built it with this idea that we wanted to protect the country, and so I think we have an opportunity to change. And we don't need to just change in our university system. We don't need to just change in the military. We don't need to just change in our government, in our political parties. It has to be wholesale. But ultimately, America is about the individual and what the individual endeavors to do in the area that they endeavor to do it, and what are the reasons behind that? What are the values and the principles that underpin that? And I think as long as, because I think about my kids, they're not Marxists. They don't. I don't think they would accept a lot of the premise that is coming out of some of these ideas. This idea where you should be ashamed of your race, right, or your religion or anything in this country. That we're a merit-based society, and that and then that the individual at the end of the day is important, and their rights should be preserved, above all else. And I think I think one of the great things about COVID is like, no, we shouldn't preserve your rights above, the right of the population. The hell with your rights. Arnold Schwarzenegger is one that said that. Right. The hell with your rights.
Right.
Like what? Like, what are you talking about?
Typical Austrian,
like he immigrated to the right, to the country. It's like he became an American. Like,
Right.
What do you mean your
Right.
rights aren't important? So I think as long as we have this ability to do things differently, to be, Elon Musk, perfect example of an American that just goes off, he comes to this country and then takes full advantage of the opportunities available to him, and then regurgitates why it is that he was able to do these things and what makes America special. This ability to really do things that are absolutely, we look at the things that SpaceX does and we're like, oh my God, But that's what America is about. It's really about this ability to change the direction of human civilization by virtue of the principles and values that we espouse and that we were formed under. This great experiment, I think, is still, as long as it exists, and as long as we can keep it functioning. Like when what's his name, Ben Franklin's asked, what kind of government do we have? And he said, it's a republic if you can keep it.
Keep it.
That's the name of the game. And I think as long as we can keep it, as dire and as doom and gloom as this podcast has gone, because it has gotten bad, I do see that, I feel like the clouds are starting to part a little bit, and we're starting to get a little bit of our mojo back. This trip that the president just made to the Middle East, the things that he did, my God, you could, just like I made this analogy on an interview the other day, when Neo gets up after he's been shot and he like kind of flexes his muscles and the world bends around him. Right. You felt in that trip that the world is beginning to bend around America again. And I think, as long as we hold true to our values, to what the Constitution is, and we celebrate those things that are entirely, what it means to be an American, that we're going to be fine. If we raise our kids to value that, we're going to be fine. If we ever get away from that, that's when and quite frankly, in the last 20 years, I think we have. But it feels like we're getting back to it. So if we ever get away from that, we'll lose. But right now, I think I'm very, very positive about the future. I think we have some great years ahead of us, because what you're going to see as all of this DEI and critical race theory and all this stuff starts getting pulled away from our society, and then, most importantly, as we start to manufacture again, which is one of the things that we gave up when we had this coupling with China. When that happens, you're going to start to see, this true embodiment of the American dream. Henry Ford, wanted to make sure that all his employees could buy a car, right? It's that kind of idea, like you can have a job and you can buy a home, you can send your kids to school, you can make life better for them. That's 99% of that is what, is typically how people think of the American dream. All of that has been lost in this relationship with China. I mean, literally,
completely agree.
Communities decimated when we sent all of our manufacturing away. So I think you're going to start to see, it's just happening right now. It's more or less manifesting in the media, but you're going to actually see it in I think individual Americans as they start to feel more positive about the future, as it starts to manifest itself in their own lives, right? A better standard of living. And it's not coming because the government's giving me money. It's coming because I'm making a wage. I'm a part of a company, and I feel like I'm contributing to something. That's where it's going to come from.
I totally agree with you. And I think earlier when you were talking about an addict and the sort of whatever it's called that you go through when you're coming off of a drug.
Withdrawal,
Withdrawal, thank you. There's going to be a rough period that Americans are going to have to get used to some of these things. And Americans are very quick to just talk about how bad things are because we don't make things anymore and all this other stuff. But, it's like, okay, but you understand that, like, because of this globalization we have, that to decouple and do these things, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be this thing. It took years for us to get into this mess, right? It's going to take years to get out of it. And it's just one of these things where it's like, Americans have shown to be a pretty resilient people in our short existence, especially when you compare it to how long the Chinese have been around. This is one of those periods. And, people are like, well, miss me with that. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to work in a factory. I don't want to do these things. It's like, well, like, I don't think it's going to look exactly like what you're talking about, but there is going to be a changeover wherein there are going to be some things that, we're going to have to deal with that are not as cushy as you're used to. People have, now that we are looking at in America with generations now of people who've never had to wonder where their next meal is coming from, for the most part. Obviously, we have a homeless population in this country, but we've gotten very, very comfortable. And, one of the things I wonder, and I see this rumor all the time, especially on X, is about Xi Jinping and the people he keeps around him, and how, dictators eventually fall because you can't have a single point of failure. You can't have, one person. Any dictator throughout history has failed because of them being a dictator in the way they control things. He's consistently firing generals. A couple years, maybe like a year and change ago now, like the whole firing of like the rocket force in China, that was a very big deal. And you consistently see these guys getting disappeared or they're losing their jobs. Do you think that sort of like echo chamber around him is getting to the point where it's going to fail? Or do you think that there's still some time on the clock, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You remember I said I don't trust anything that comes out of China. I think anybody predicting the Communist Party kind of imploding on itself, because of political disagreements, I just don't buy it. I think they've been very, very disciplined. But consequently, when you think about China, what China is today, China was really formed in 1949. The Communist Party came to power in 1949. So,
Yep.
When you think about them as everybody points to their 5,000 year civilization. A lot of different governments, a lot of different dynasties during that time. In reality, America is a much older country. From a time period, 1776. To 1949. So, almost 200 years older than China is as a country. So I think, I don't believe that they're going to, as a party, as the Communist Party is going to go away anytime soon. I don't think Xi Jinping is under any threat of losing his job. I mean, look at Mao. I mean, Mao, he was on the rope so many times and, did so many things, and he stayed in power all the way till the very end of his life. Mm-hmm. So, and then when he was replaced, the party didn't go away, right? The party kept going. So I think the party's going to keep going. I don't put any stock in anybody that says, oh, China's going to collapse or the Communist Party is going to fail. They know what their problems are, and they're going to do the things to stay in power. Will China ever not be a communist country? Who knows? But I think at the end of the day, that's not for us to worry about or even think about. It's not for us to even wonder or hope. It's for us to focus on ourselves and to ensure that the American people are thriving and that we are not manifesting the same kind of Marxist views that the Chinese Communist Party is, and not allowing them or enabling them or helping them to promote either their Marxism or anybody else's Marxism. And I think that's where the decoupling becomes important, because if we're investing in our own people and we're doing our own things, then you're going to start to see America shine.
I think that's a great way to wrap that up. For us to worry more about what we need to do than what other people are doing, and just essentially outwork another country and learn to love our country again. So many people have definitely lost that. So, but I appreciate you coming on and talking to me, especially about some of the little niche Air Force stupidities. I know I'm sure you dealt with quite a lot of that, definitely from a different angle than a tech sergeant did. But I appreciate your time. If anybody would like to go follow you on social media, routinely talking about China, as you'd expect, the offer of 2 books about China. But again, thank you very much for your time, guys. If you're listening and you're new here, we appreciate you listening. Give us a follow, hit that follow button. It doesn't cost you anything, and then hit the show notes where you can find our sponsors, and then go over to redpillthreads.com/I Came With Fire for our merch. My favorite shirt is definitely the Teddy Roosevelt Brutal American shirt, and you can get that over there, and then they'll ship it out to you within a couple days. So, but thank you so much for your time, and you have a good day.